If your last name is Danish, there is a real chance it once meant something far more dangerous than a name on a passport. Long before spreadsheets and census forms, these names marked which coastline you defended, which king you served, which fortress your family answered to, or which crown eventually tried to destroy you entirely. One name on this list does not just connect to a Viking chieftain somewhere in the fog of legend. It connects to a documented king who ruled Denmark, England, and Norway at the same time, a union so large it briefly reshaped Northern Europe. If that name is yours, you are not just Danish. You may be carrying the last surviving fragment of an empire, and you will not see it coming until the very end of this list. Number 10. Skov. On paper, it looks simple. It means forest, nothing more. But in the world before unified Denmark, when Jutland, Zealand, Scania, and Funen functioned as separate, rival petty kingdoms rather than one nation, the forest was not scenery. It was strategy. Dense woodland marked the border between territories, and families who controlled the tree line controlled who could move an army, a raiding party, or a tax collector through it undetected. Old land charters tied to forest-edge settlements show families using exactly this kind of name to mark themselves as border holders, not woodsmen tending timber for the season. That is not a small detail. A name that sounds peaceful was once a claim on the most contested ground in the region, the kind of land nobody handed over without a fight, and the kind of position that made a family a target the moment tensions rose between neighboring territories. Later church and tax records show the name persisting in exactly these border zones long after the petty kingdoms themselves were absorbed into a single crown under later Danish kings. The border disappeared from every modern map. The name did not disappear with it. And the next name on this list did not hide behind a forest. It stood in the open, and it was named for a bird that circled battlefields long after the fighting had stopped. Number 9. Krag. The old form is usually understood as crow, and in the sagas and skaldic verse of the Norse world, crows were not decoration. They followed war, feeding on what war left behind, and poets used the bird constantly as a symbol of the battlefield itself, a grim companion to warriors rather than a simple woodland creature. A name built from a battlefield bird was rarely given lightly, and family traditions tied to the Krag name in later Danish nobility connect it to military service, not farming or trade. This is where the name turns dangerous. Some records tied to this name reach into royal court circles centuries later. Families who advised kings, held military commissions, and sat near thrones, not because they inherited soft privilege, but because their name already carried the memory of the battlefield before they ever set foot in a court corridor. If this is your surname, you may have heard it your entire life without knowing it once marked a family that watched wars for a living and were trusted, afterward, to advise on the next one. But the next name did not carry a weapon at all. It carried something the crown feared even more than an army: faith, and the wealth that came quietly with it. Number 8. Munk. It means monk, and that sounds like the opposite of danger. Here is the twist. Monasteries in the Viking Age and the centuries that followed were not soft retreats from the world. They held land, wealth, and literacy in a world where almost no one outside the church could read or write, which meant they held quiet control over contracts, inheritances, and disputes that ordinary lords could not touch. A family associated with monastery life did not just pray. They kept records, managed vast estates, negotiated on behalf of the crown, and often held more real, practical power than a minor noble house ever could. Monastery chronicles across Denmark preserve the monk name attached to exactly this kind of administrative authority, the kind that rarely gets remembered because it never needed a sword to enforce it. That is power dressed as humility. Later, some branches of this name moved from religious life directly into the nobility itself, a jump that was never supposed to be easy for anyone outside the ruling families. Most people never hear that part. And the next name belonged to a bird that only the powerful were legally allowed to keep. Number 7. Falk. Falcon. In medieval Scandinavia, falconry was not a hobby for the wealthy. It was a mark of status reserved almost exclusively for nobility and royal courts, and the birds themselves were valuable enough to be exchanged as diplomatic gifts between competing kings across Europe. A family name built on the falcon was not describing wildlife they happened to admire. It was describing access, the kind of access that let a family stand close enough to a throne to be trusted with the king's own hunting birds. Land charters connected to families bearing this name show ties to court service rather than farmland, the kind of quiet, constant proximity to power that history rarely records the way it records a battle. This is not a small detail either. Power does not always look like a sword raised in the open. Sometimes it looks like a bird sitting calmly on a gloved hand at a royal hunt, while its keeper listens to everything being said nearby. But the next name did not serve a king from the mainland at all. It came from an island the crown could never afford to lose. Number 6. Holm. The old form points toward a small island or a fortified islet, and this is where Denmark's real military engineering enters the story. Denmark built ring fortresses, structures like the Trelleborg-type strongholds, on strategic islands and waterways, specifically because whoever controlled the water controlled trade routes, raiding paths, and every invasion that came by sea. A family carrying the Holm name was historically associated with exactly these defensible island positions, not quiet fishing settlements. This was never a peaceful posting. Holding an island fortress meant absorbing the first wave of any attack that came from open water, long before word could reach the mainland. Families with this name appear in later land and tax records tied to these strategic waterways long after the fortresses themselves had fallen into ruin and been half forgotten. The name outlived the walls that gave it meaning. If this name is in your family, the old maps point toward water your ancestors were expected to defend with their lives, not simply live beside. But the next name belonged to people who did not wait behind any walls at all. They came from somewhere else entirely, and arriving alive was the achievement. Number 5. Vinther. Winter. It sounds like a season, but names built from seasonal words in old Scandinavian naming traditions were often tied to when a family arrived, settled, or was formally recorded, not simply to the weather outside. Migration and settlement records from the era following Denmark's unification under the Jelling dynasty show families adopting exactly this kind of descriptive marker as they moved into new territory during the harshest months, when only the most committed or most desperate families relocated at all. This is where the story turns quieter, but not softer. Surviving a Scandinavian winter migration was its own kind of warfare, fought against cold, hunger, failing supplies, and unfamiliar land, with no guarantee anyone would still be standing by spring. A name that seems ordinary today was once living proof that a family endured something most of their neighbors never had to face. Most people carrying this name now have no idea it may have started as a survival marker rather than a simple description. But the next name belonged to a family the history books actually remember by name, and that changes everything about how provable this list becomes. Number 4. Trolle. This is where the list stops speculating and starts naming documented nobility. The Trolle family is one of the oldest recorded noble houses in Danish history, appearing in land charters and royal service records for centuries, tied directly to major landholdings and positions close to the crown itself. Families bearing this name were not simply associated with power at a distance. They were named participants in it, holding castles outright, serving on royal councils, and marrying into other major noble houses across Scandinavia to consolidate influence generation after generation. That is not a naming tradition built on suggestion. That is a documented dynasty, traceable through the same kinds of land charters and court appointments historians still study today. The surname tradition tied to Trolle reaches directly into the highest levels of medieval Danish government, the kind of proof anchor most surnames on this list can only gesture toward from a distance. If this is your name, the old records are not implying nobility somewhere in the background. In this case, they are recording it in plain, dated ink. But the next name belonged to a family whose power became so dangerous to the crown, it ended in exile and public disgrace. Number 3. Rosenkrantz. Say it slowly, because you have heard it before, even if you did not know it was real. This is a genuine ancient Danish noble house, one whose name became famous far beyond Denmark's borders through court records and later literature that borrowed it freely without ever explaining where it truly came from or who actually carried it. Strip away that outside fame, and what remains is a family documented across generations in royal service, land grants, and court positions at the very center of Danish political life, long before anyone outside Denmark had heard the name at all. Families with this name were often associated with the machinery of the crown itself, not the battlefield, but the quiet rooms where decisions about the battlefield were actually made, negotiated, and signed into law by people the public rarely saw. That is a different kind of danger, the kind built on loyalty, rivalry, and proximity to a throne that could reward its own nobles one year and destroy them the next without warning or explanation. The name survived court intrigue, shifting dynasties, and centuries of political turnover that ended lesser, less careful families completely. Most people never hear that part, distracted by the version of the name they recognize from somewhere else entirely. And the next name belonged to a man whose loyalty to the crown collapsed so completely, his name became a warning told inside the palace for generations afterward. Number 2. Ulfeldt. This is where the story turns darker. The Ulfeldt name is tied to one of the most dramatic falls from power in Danish noble history, a family that rose to extraordinary influence at the royal court, married directly into the ruling house itself, and was then accused of treason so severe it led to exile, confiscated land, and a reputation the crown actively tried to bury for generations afterward, even erasing references to it in official records. Court and legal records connected to this name do not describe a quiet, forgettable family fading into the countryside. They describe a rise and a fall large enough to be remembered centuries later as a cautionary tale told inside the palace itself, to remind future nobles exactly how far a family could fall from grace. A name that sounds unfamiliar today once sat close enough to a throne to genuinely threaten it, not merely serve it from a respectful distance. That is not a naming tradition built on distant association. That is a family the crown could not fully forget, and could not fully forgive, no matter how many generations passed or how quietly later descendants tried to live. And now we arrive at the name that does not just touch a Danish court. It touches an empire that once stretched across an entire sea. Number 1. Knudsen. Say it out loud. Son of Knud. In English, son of Knut. And if that name feels familiar, it should, because Knut the Great was not simply a Danish king among many. He ruled Denmark, England, and Norway together, uniting them under a single crown in what historians call the North Sea Empire, one of the most powerful political unions medieval Northern Europe ever produced, and one that briefly made Denmark the center of an empire spanning 2 seas. A surname built directly from his name does not merely gesture toward Viking heritage the way other entries on this list carefully do. It carries the actual name of the king whose empire briefly redrew the map of Northern Europe, preserved in royal genealogies, chronicled reigns, and documented history still taught in schools across multiple countries to this day. The name does not prove that every modern bearer descends from Knut himself, but historically, it belongs to a naming tradition built entirely around his reign, spread through generations by families who lived under him, served him directly, or simply carried his memory forward long after his empire itself had fractured and disappeared. Of every name on this list, this is the one that reaches the furthest, because it reaches for a crown that once sat across an entire sea, held by one king, for one brief and extraordinary moment in Danish history. 10 names. 10 different doors into the same vanished world of forests that marked borders, birds that marked status, monasteries that held real power, islands that had to be defended, winters that had to be survived, noble houses that rose on loyalty and fell on suspicion, and one name that reached all the way to an empire spanning 2 seas. A surname is never just a label sitting quietly on a document, filled in without a second thought. It is a compressed history, carrying pieces of kingdoms that no longer exist on any modern map, wars no history class ever taught you, and journeys your family made, without leaving behind a single diary to explain how they survived them. If one of these names is yours, you are not just looking at a family tree stretching backward on a screen. You are looking at a fragment of a kingdom that used to be real, defended by real people, carried forward by families who never called themselves historians, just survivors doing whatever it took to keep the name alive. Comment your surname below, along with the region or country your family traces back to, and tell me which forgotten name, bloodline, or kingdom you want decoded next. Because somewhere out there, another ordinary name on another passport is still waiting to be traced all the way back to a crown, a battlefield, or an empire nobody ever told its owner about.